Hey there, hope everyone's doing all right. This week I wanted to dive into Sonata Form. Um, I'm sure you've all played a sonata at some point, or have had students that have played sonatas. But this is the form of most first movements in instrumental sonatas, symphonies, concertos, since at least the 1770s, 1780s. It was effectively the flagship instrumental form for most of the classical era and even the early Romantic, though it gradually fell out of favor in the early 20th century. It's sometimes called the Sonata Allegro form, but this can be a little misleading as not all sonata forms are allegro. Some of them are slow tempos. If you're looking for a lot of detail about sonata form, Charles Rosen's book Sonata Forms is a really good resource for that. It's better to think of sonata form not as like a mold to be filled, but as a method of composing with multiple motivic ideas, and how to transform and eventually reconcile those motivic ideas throughout the course of the work. Imagine something like the hero's journey or the three-act structure, but for music, and that's especially true of early Romantic works. In your Barry text on page 148, he discusses three conventions that the classical sonata has kind of settled on. The first convention is contrasting thematic complexes in two tonal regions. Here, a thematic complex or a theme group is the motivic material that occupies one of those two tonal regions. It's called a theme group because it's possible to have more than one motivic idea in a tonal area. The next convention is an increasingly fluctuant thematic development, where this is where the motivic ideas are varied and explored. And then finally, you have a restatement of those themes in the primary tonic. And this provides kind of like a unification of the previous tonal opposition. So these three conventions are manifested in the three major sections of a sonata, that being the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. It's worth noting that these are conventions and not rules. Composers didn't follow them to the letter, and good composers even incorporated their own modifications into their sonatas. The thing about conventions is that once established, they're just too conventional. So don't expect every sonata to be exactly the same. At first, it can be tempting to view the sonata as a kind of expanded compound ternary, since both are in three parts. But in general, it's best to avoid these comparisons. While they both have tripartite division, how and when motives are employed is vastly different. In a compound ternary, what makes the B section B is new motivic material. Whereas in a conventional sonata, all of the motivic material is presented at the very beginning in the exposition. So the first part of the sonata is the exposition. And the exposition is going to present the motivic ideas or theme groups in two tonal areas. The first theme group usually opens a piece in the primary tonic, and the musical material is very straightforward, easy to develop. You're going to see a lot of arpeggios. This is typically the most memorable motivic idea and the most likely to be developed later. Some works will begin with a slow introduction, but this isn't part of the exposition proper. Beethoven's Fourth Symphony starts like this, for instance. So unsurprisingly, in the exposition of the sonata, you're going to have a lot of expository functioning material, but you won't have just expository functions in the exposition. You also have transitions, because at some point the first theme group material will cadence and give way to a transition. This transition will include a modulation to the second key area. This will typically arrive on the dominant of the second key, and this point is called the medial caesura, and it immediately precedes the second theme group. The transitions you'll see usually come in two different kinds. You have a dependent transition, which uses material from the first theme group as the basis for the transition, or you can have an independent transition, which uses new material during the transition. So your second theme group is normally going to have a contrasting character to the first. For instance, if the first theme group was melodically disjunct, the second theme group is going to be conjunct. The first theme group was forte, your second theme group is more likely going to be piano. The second theme group can technically be in any key, but most of the time in major key sonatas, the second theme group is going to be in the dominant, and in minor key sonatas, the second theme group is going to be in the relative major. The second theme group is often longer than the first theme group, and I've found that the second theme group is more likely to have multiple motives than the first. So don't be surprised if there seems to be more than one motivic idea in the second theme group. Eventually, the second theme group will give way to a closing theme, which will be in the same key as the second theme group. A common analytical error is to mistake the closing material for a second or a third motivic idea in the second theme group. Sometimes it's really hard to tell. But generally, the closing theme will be the last new idea in the second theme group. And listen for those characteristics of the terminative function that we talked about, because those can help you identify what might be a closing theme. Remember that closing themes are not codas or codettas. In sonata form, you may have a codetta at the end of the exposition, and you may have a coda at the end of the recapitulation. The development of the sonata is going to be the most variable part of the sonata. Classical era sonatas typically kept the development short, but late classical and early romantic composers such as Beethoven and Schubert would extend this section quite a bit. At the beginning of the development, it's most common to see motivic material from the first theme group. It'll kind of sound like the exposition starting over again, but it's not. This first theme group material is most likely to be developed, as I said before, but it's possible for any motivic idea to be developed, even if it seemed insignificant in the exposition. I've seen closing themes and independent transitions be developed in the development section of sonatas. At the end of a development, there's almost always going to be a retransition back to tonic. So keep an eye out for a dominant pedal for the primary tonic. That will usually indicate that your development section is coming to a close, and to watch out for your recapitulation. Keep an eye out for false recapitulations. Sometimes composers like to play a trick on their audience and start the first theme group material, or make you think that the development section has ended and the recapitulation has begun when it actually hasn't. So be sure to watch out for the keys there. In short, with developments, kind of anything goes. This is the section where the composer has the most creative freedom, which makes it one of the most interesting sections of the sonata. So the final section of a sonata is the recapitulation. And the recapitulation is structured very similarly to the exposition, but with one crucial difference. Both the first theme group and the second theme group are going to be in the tonic key. Hearing the second theme group idea in the tonic is a compelling moment, especially when you have a minor key sonata and you hear the second theme group in a minor key. So recapitulations are pretty straightforward. By and large, they'll seem like repetitions of the exposition, obviously with both theme groups in the same key though. Occasionally in a major key sonata, you might encounter a subdominant return. This is when the recapitulation begins in the key of the subdominant and uses the same up a fifth modulation that it used in the exposition to go up a fifth from the subdominant to the tonic. For instance, if I have a sonata in G major and I have to modulate from G major to D major for my second theme group, I could start my recapitulation in C major and use that same modulation going up a fifth to go from C major to G major, so that my second theme group is in the primary tonic of G major. This doesn't happen a whole lot, but watch out for that because it is possible. In your Clendening book, you'll often come across diagrams of sonata form, some of which are helpful to varying degrees. This is my favorite diagram here that I guess Maestro Cookie Meister made. But you see the Oreo as the first theme group, that pink cookie as the second theme group, and then they're all sort of mashed up in the development. But then in the recapitulation, we have the first theme group. And notice the second theme group has some pink in there, but is also an Oreo. I'm not entirely sure what that's supposed to mean, but I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be the second theme group motives presented in the key of the first theme group. So understandably, all this is really difficult to take in until we see an example. This sonata form can be very expansive. It's common for first movements to be 10 to 20 minutes long. And this can make them difficult to analyze. And so instead of looking at a very expansive piece, I like to show my students this sonatina. It doesn't contain all the minutiae that is present in larger sonatas, but all the conventions are there and very clearly laid out on one page. Keep in mind that this is a tiny sonata, so there's only going to be one motivic idea in each key area, but more expansive sonatas, as I said before, can have more than one motivic idea in a tonal area. So let's listen to this one before we really jump into the analysis. Okay, so like I said, really short, but again, everything is there that we're looking for in a sonata. All those conventions. We have our first theme group in the primary tonic of C major in the first 4 measures. In measure 5, this theme restarts, but begins a transition and a modulation to the second key area. Again, this is a really short sonata, so he has to make the most of this space here. And so in this case, in measure 5, 6, this would be a dependent transition because it's using material from the first theme group, the first 4 bars, to modulate to the dominant here. We have an elision from measures 7 to 8, a perfect authentic cadence from measures 7 to 8, but we also have the second theme group starting right there in measure 8. and this one is in the key of the dominant. Notice the F sharp there. In measure 12, that's where we kind of start getting our closing theme, and then we come to a cadence there in the key of the dominant in G major. And then there's going to be of course, a repeat bar. You'd repeat this whole thing. In measure 16, this is where our development starts. And so notice that he starts with the first theme group material. But here, obviously, he's using it in a very different way. 16 through 19, we have development of the first theme group material in C minor. We have the same rhythm and contour, but the harmonies are shifting here. At the forte, there in measure 20, we have development of the second theme group in C minor. Notice the octaves there in 20 to 23. Whereas before we used the octaves as the melodic material, here he's using the octaves as an accompaniment. And of course in measure 23, we get a half cadence that will lead us back to the recapitulation, to our primary tonic. In measure 24 to 27, we have the first theme group in our primary tonic. It's down an octave, but it's in our primary tonic. It's our motivic material from the first theme group. Notice in measure 28 to 30, we have a transition. We are transitioning from one motivic idea, the first theme group, to another, but we aren't modulating here. Notice that he stays in the same key. And there in measure 31, we have the second theme group in the primary tonic in C major. And so we have both themes unified by the same key. And there in measure 35 to the end, we have the closing theme and then the final cadence in the primary key of C major. Again, it's worth mentioning that this sonata is the exception, but I like to start with this one because it does fit on one page, whereas most sonatas are going to be many, many pages, usually hundreds of measures, and 5 to 10, even upwards of 20, 25 minutes. So it's relatively easy to keep track of the themes in a short piece like the Clementi, but for longer pieces, you may need to label where those themes are. When performing analysis, it can be helpful to use a shorthand to describe the different themes. Musicologist Jan LaRue developed symbols that are often seen in academic writings about sonata form, and we'll use at least some of those when we do our analysis. When you see a P, that's going to stand for a primary theme, or the first theme group. When you see a T, that's going to be a transitional theme, or the transition. An S will be you guessed it, secondary theme. And then the K will stand for the closing theme. And we'll often put a number in front of one of these abbreviations to define which theme, since there can be more than one. So for instance, if you see a 1P, that's going to stand for the first motive in the first theme group. If you see a 1S, that's going to be the first motive in the second theme group. And then, of course, a 2S would be the second theme in the second theme group. Is anybody confused yet? Let's look at the Clementi here. So if you recall in our exposition, measure 1 through 4 was our first theme group and our primary theme. So there we would put a 1P to indicate that that's our first primary theme. Since we said our transition starts maybe at measure 5, 6, we could put the T there. This is a dependent transition. We really only have one, so we would just put a 1T, or just the T here, since we don't have more than one. There in measure 8, we would put our 1S, since that is the secondary theme. And so there in measure 12, we would put our K for closing theme. Now in the development, we could there are ways to describe themes that are derived from other themes, but we'll talk about those later. And so this would be the same for the recapitulation. So there in measure 24, when the recapitulation actually starts, there again we would see a 1P, telling us that that's our primary motive there. And then in measure 31, we'd have a 1S, telling us that's the first motive of our second theme group. Here we don't have a second motive of the second theme group, but there in measure 35, that would probably put a K to indicate that that's our closing theme. So to get an idea of what's going on in sonata form, you really have to look at a lot of different sonatas. The Clementi that we looked at is not a typical sonata. That's a very tiny sonata. That's why we looked at it. But I wanted to look at a more typical sonata. I'll put a link to the entire movement in the description. And I think it would be a good idea for you to listen to the entire thing first before going forward with the analysis. But I will include clips of what we'll be talking about in this video. Before you start an analysis of a sonata, it's always good to consider what you might expect to see in the piece, especially in terms of key areas. So we'll be looking at this Beethoven sonata, Opus 14, number 2. It's in G major. So from what we know about sonata form, obviously the first part's going to be in G major, in the first theme group. But the second theme group is going to be in, or we'd expect it to be in D major. And then, of course, in between, there's going to be some sort of transition and modulation. In the development section, since both of these are in the major mode, we might expect to hear one of the themes in the minor mode. And then, of course, in the recapitulation, we're going to hear both themes in the primary tonic of G major. That's what we expect. But obviously, until we do the analysis, we won't know. So this particular sonata starts out like a lot of sonata forms. As we mentioned before, it's not uncommon to see arpeggiated themes in the first theme group. And that's what we see here. It doesn't look like it at first glance, but it is. We have a lot of neighbor tones, the A sharp moving to the B, and of course the F sharp moving to the G, help outline a G major triad. And so our first theme group is the first 8 bars here. We've got basically what is a sentence ending in a perfect authentic cadence in measure 8. And then in measure 9, that's where our transition begins, already in measure 9. Now if you notice, the melodic material in measure 9 is much different than in what we saw in the first 8 bars. It starts out relatively static, right? But this is going to increase in melodic movement as we move through the transition. By the time we get to measure 19, we have that sort of like standing on the dominant there. Of course, this is the dominant of D major, so we have A major here. But we do have that dominant pedal from measure 19 to 24. Measure 25 is the medial caesura there, kind of as a moment of respite before we move on to the next theme group. And so in measure 26, there we hear the second theme group. So this is in the key that we would expect, D major. It's basically a sequential period, but there's an elision in measure 33 with the next motive of this tonal area. What we would label as 2S here, whereas the first one obviously we would label 1S, 1 for the first and S for the second theme group. The second motive here in the second theme group is a little less cut and dry than your typical sonata. In my analysis, I included everything from measure 33 to 46 in the second motive of the second theme group. And that's largely based on harmonies. You'll notice that in measure 41 that you have a lot of 32nd notes, and it's building up to this cadence there in measure 44. I included this with the 2S because this is very cadential in nature. It's, as I said, increasing the rhythmic motion as it approaches this cadence. And so we have that cadence there in 44. And then 45 and 46, we just have a cadential extension there. At 47, we start our closing theme. And this is basically a contrasting period from measure 47 to 57. And then at measure 58, we have our codetta. And you notice our codetta is going to have a lot of the terminative function. We have a lot of alterations between tonic and dominant. We have a tonic pedal point. Tonic now because we're in D major. And then, of course, we end in measure 63 in D major. Since there's no real set form for development sections, I thought it might be helpful just to discuss where these themes are used and how they're used. As we said, we might expect to see our primary motive, the first theme group motive, in the minor mode. And that's exactly what happens in measure 64. We hear it not in G major, but in G minor. And obviously this doesn't stay in G minor for long. He develops this. You kind of have this overlapping in measure 70 and 71, and he modulates to B flat major. In 74, we have the first theme of the second theme group. And here he starts in B flat major and modulates to A flat major. For the next part in the development, from measure 81 to 98, he uses the first theme group motive in A flat. And then in G minor, and then eventually he modulates to E flat major. And there in measure 99, we have a false recapitulation. Notice he gives us the dominant of E flat, and then begins what sounds like the first theme group. This sounds like the recapitulation starting, but it actually isn't. Obviously, in the recapitulation, we expect to hear G major, but we don't hear that. We hear E flat in this case. So this false recapitulation might give the average listener the impression that the recapitulation has started until about measure 103, when things definitely start to fall apart. And in measure 107, we hear the 32nd notes, and this is very reminiscent of the 32nd notes from the second theme group in the exposition. This is also where the dominant pedal begins. You'll notice that D is sustained, although it's it's held in the left hand here, and so it's not as prominent as it will be in measure 115. And in measure 115, he begins with an actual dominant pedal, with an actual dominant harmony there, while using fragments from the first theme group. And then finally, in measure 125, we get our real recapitulation here in G major, in the key that we would expect. And from here, from measure 125 to 132, this is the same as measures 1 through 8. We start the transition in measures 133. And here, in the transition, everything's going to be the same until measure 137, where we have a movement to the subdominant. We have a G7 moving to a C major. This movement to the subdominant is going to be very common in recapitulations. Sometimes, as we mentioned, recapitulations can start in the subdominant. This wouldn't be considered a subdominant return like the recapitulation starting in the subdominant, but this is very common in recapitulations because that up a fifth modulation that we heard in the exposition will move us from C major to G major for the second theme group. And then, of course, there in measure 153, we hear the second theme group in G major. And everything is basically the same as the exposition, except, obviously, it's in the primary tonic here. It sort of unifies the first theme group and the second theme group in the same key. It's not until the end that we have some differences from the exposition. And in this case, at measures 187, we have a coda, not a codetta. We actually have a coda that's going to end our piece here. And our coda sounds a lot like the first theme group material. But in this case, he's using a lot of terminative function. We've got our tonic pedal point. We've got a little development. We're hearing the first theme group motive in ways that we really haven't heard it before. And then we're hearing a lot of alteration between tonic and dominant, especially there at the end. And that's what rounds out the piece here. So as I mentioned before, doing analysis of different pieces is very important in really understanding sonata form, because there's lots of different ways that it can be expressed. Every composer has slightly different things they do in their sonatas, and so being able to recognize the conventions that we talked about through all of the creative stuff that the composers put in their sonatas can be a little tricky at times. So again, I recommend looking at a lot of different sonatas